Welcome back, everyone, to the course, the ILR course, Echoes of the Past, Visions of the Future, which is organized by the Center for the Humanities and the Public Sphere. And today's presentation is called Reclaiming the Past, Art, Repatriation, and Colonial Histories, and it's given by Dr. Porchia Moore. And she is Associate Professor at the UF Department of Museum Studies in the School of Art and Art History, and she collaborates with museums in and around Gainesville while teaching courses such as methods of research and bibliography, exhibitions and collections management, global arts and museology, and a seminar in museum studies. Additionally, she's Associate Director of the UF Center for Arts, Migration, and Entrepreneurship. Professor Moore received a PhD from the University of South Carolina in the School of Library and Information Science and the McKissick Museum Management Program. She's an international keynote speaker, strategist, facilitator, educator, and activist scholar, working in and with institutions that want to achieve deep inclusion. Professor Moore? Go ahead.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Good morning. I'm going to put on my teacher hat and ask if everyone would be willing to move to the front, please. Thank you. First of all, I want to say when Jamie reached out to invite me, I was really excited personally because my dear friend, Dr. Carol McCusker, is always raving about the lectures here. And I've been wanting to attend for a long time just as a guest, but then it was like really special to be able to get like an invite. So thank you so much, Jamie. Again, my name is Dr. Porchia Moore. I want to also thank you all for inviting me as well. I tend to talk probably too much. So if you have a question while I'm rambling a little bit, please feel free to raise your hand and I'm happy to ask questions, or we can save the questions until the end. Oh, I didn't check. Oh, sorry. Okay.
Yeah, you should be good.
Okay. And I can just, okay.
I guess pointed at it and it goes forward.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So as a museum studies scholar, what I am essentially initially looking at is the history and study of museums. But I also enjoy working as a curator as well. And so I wanted to first share with you just some images of some of my early curatorial work. I first sort of began my foray into curating at the Columbia Museum of Art in Columbia, South Carolina, just a sort of small state museum. And I'm really proud of the work that I was able to do here. So the museum came to me and said, we've heard from the community and we want to begin to show more work from African-American artists in our collection. And so they gave me a large gallery space in the museum to curate African-American work from the permanent collection. The problem was that I got about 1.5 rotations in and we were out of work from African-American artists in the permanent collection. And so I had to work with community members and collectors to continue to be able to curate that show or that gallery, but also beginning to have some really important institutional conversations about why we needed to shift our acquisition and collecting policies to be more inclusive. And so, as Rick mentioned, I have a doctorate in library and information science, which is a little bit odd maybe, as someone who focuses mainly on museums. I was one of 7 people who was awarded the first and only ever Laura Bush 21st Century Fellowship, administered by the Institute of Library Museum Science. And essentially with this fellowship, it was called a chill fellowship. So I'm a chill librarian, which literally means cultural heritage informatics leadership librarian, which is a mouthful. But essentially what that means is we were put together as a small cohort to identify problems in the 21st century cultural heritage sector. And we were asked to consider practical policies and best practices for problem solving these particular issues that we were sort of thinking through. And we were encouraged to be multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary. And we were really sort of taught to be what we call cross-pollinators. So what that means is when we talk about the cultural heritage sector, we're talking about what is called the GLAM sector, which stands for galleries, libraries, archives, museums, and repositories. So I'm quite literally trained to move across all of these different cultural heritage sectors as a chill librarian. Ooh. Okay, thank you. And so again, as a chill librarian, it was really exciting to me because we had our foundational scholarship within library and information science, but it also includes traditional museum studies, archival studies, public history, geography, public administration, just across multiple disciplines. Okay, next slide. And so in my time in the PhD program, I really was reading work, again, across disciplines. And the question that I wanted to answer specifically on a really personal level is why is it that when I visited museums specifically, I would often be the only person of color or one of a small handful of people of color? My mother was a 4th grade teacher in South Carolina. She taught in rural South Carolina. And she was largely in charge of organizing school field trips. And so we went to museums like all the time. And I fell in love with museums as a kid. Like I was the nerdy kid that was like, where are we going to the museum? While other kids were like going to football games and basketball games, I was going with my mother to learn about plantations and to learn about historic sites. And so in that early time of my doctoral study, I started to try to understand what this conversation was around decolonizing museums and thinking about what is a museum. And the early research that I was looking at largely suggested that when we talk about decolonization, that it actually was not possible on the continent of Africa for a number of reasons. So lots of scholars would suggest things like, well, we can't possibly return these items to the continent because there's too much civil and political unrest, right? Like we would return these objects and then there would be some kind of civil war. Or people would say things like, well, how could you possibly practice like best practices in terms of like climate control and things like that because it's Africa. So there's all these sort of stereotypes about Africa, right? Then there would be almost this sort of like outright bias that essentially would suggest that there are no museums in Africa, which was also largely alarming to me. And so in 2021, I was an affiliate faculty with the Center for Arts, Migration, and Entrepreneurship. I had not yet stepped into the associate director role. And they asked me to be one of the keynote speakers for their inaugural sort of conference. And this is when I began really honing in on this particular scholarship. And so the presentation that I gave at that initial conference was called Sankofa, Sending the Benin Bronzes Home, the Luxuries of Identity Politics, and All Eyes on Africa's Museum Bloom. And essentially what that meant to me was all of a sudden, I started reading about all of these museums that were opening up on the continent of Africa. And I was trying to figure out what was kind of causing that. And there was multiple things, and we can talk about that later in the Q&A. But one of the things was at the height of the pandemic, as well as when at the murder of George Floyd, we started to see all of these museums writing um, statements about Black Lives Matter and making declarations about how they needed to be inclusive. And then that escalated to this global conversation around decolonizing museums. Next slide. And so for me, this was even more exciting because there was a global conversation happening around the question of what is a museum? So if I were to ask you all, and feel free to like shout it out, but what is a museum? How would you define a museum? What's a museum? A collection of treasures? Okay, great, thank you. Anyone else? Historical artifacts? Okay, one more person. Say it again. Oh, cultural artifacts. Yes, thank you. And so within the museum world, we were starting to have this like actual battle about the definition of a museum. And so the question that I began to really hone in on for myself is, does the definition of a museum drive the experience and the function of a museum in the 21st century, and helping us understand what is the museum's purpose? So like, why do you go to a museum? Do you go for entertainment? Do you go for fun? Do you go to learn? Do you go because your family's coming in town and you have no idea what to do with them, and so you drag them to the museum? Like, what's the purpose of a museum? Next slide, please. And so what was interesting is there's an organization called ICOM, which stands for the International Council of Museums. And ICOM is the global organization that puts forth best practices for museum work in the field. And it's a huge collective of different museum professionals across the globe. And the last time that ICOM presented a definition for museums was in 2007. And I'm going to read to you what the definition is. A museum is a nonprofit permanent institution in the service of society and its development, open to the public, which acquires, conserves, researches, communicates, and exhibits the tangible and intangible heritage of humanity and its environment for the purposes of education, study, and enjoyment. So raise your hand if you think that's a pretty okay definition. Okay. Does anybody not like that definition? Okay. So there's a couple things that are happening here with this 2007 definition. First of all, not all museums are nonprofit. Next, not all museums in the 21st century are actually collecting institutions, right? And we're starting to see more and more private museums and like pop-up museums, what we call Instagram museums. So social media and the digital age has actually transformed what we think of as a museum. But also, again, this idea of the purpose of education, study, and enjoyment. So there's all these things that are happening in the field that are actually shifting the paradigm about what we think of as a museum. And so the ICOM has an annual meeting, and they put forth a large committee of people to basically come together and work on and propose a new definition of a museum. And so they were supposed to vote on this definition in Kyoto, Japan, and everything, all hell broke loose. So they proposed this definition, and it was met with so much outrage that they fired the head of the committee. And then they had to come together and think through again what that definition might be. And if you Google it, you're going to find like dozens of articles about this. Went on for almost 2 years, this debate about this proposed definition, to the point where there was actually almost like a fight that happened between nations in Kyoto, and they halted, oh, I'm sorry, next slide. They halted the actual voting of this proposed definition. So I'm going to share with you the proposed definition. Museums are democratizing, inclusive, and polyphonic spaces for critical dialogue about the past and the futures. Acknowledging and addressing the conflicts and challenges of the present, they hold artifacts and specimens in trust for society, safeguard diverse memories for future generations, and guarantee equal rights and equal access to heritage for all. Museums are not for profit, they are participatory and transparent and work in active partnership with and for diverse communities to collect, preserve, research, interpret, exhibit, and enhance understandings of the world, aiming to contribute to human dignity and social justice, global equality, and planetary well being. Okay, raise your hand. Do you like this definition? I'm seeing people say no, shaking their head vigorously. Okay, if you raise your hand and you like this definition, what do you like about it? Okay. 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 Thank you. Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. Perfect. Perfect. Anyone else? Oh, you can't hear me? Oh. Oh. Sure. If you don't, okay. Thank you.
Do you want to repeat what you just said? Okay, where do I start?
Yeah.
Start
You can
with who?
right here. Thank you.
I was saying that I like how it emphasizes inclusivity and safeguarding diverse artifacts and memories, but I'm kind of halfway on how I feel about it because I also agree it's very aspirational because especially if we're considering museums in a global context, not all of them prioritize preserving equal access to memory and instead may prioritize preserving the dominant cultural memory of wherever they exist. So I like it, but I also am like, but it might not accurately represent all museums.
Thank you. Okay. Did everybody hear that? Okay.
Any other comment? You got a comment or question?
Thank you.
Just a little note on the word polyphonic, no, that's many voices.
Yes.
I just love that word there in the description and the idea that it's a critical dialogue, which is that your mind is just going to be working and there's going to be conversations and there's going to be, a open-minded way of looking at everything.
Thank you for saying that. That is my favorite word in this proposed. And so, come here. Thank you.
I think in view of what's happening, it's unrealistic. Museums are increasingly selling off their paintings to keep the lights on. Randolph University has sold to Crystal Bridges. Others have. It simply doesn't reflect today's realities.
Thank you. Okay. So, you all are quite literally mirroring the exact sort of sentiments that happened or that were stated in Kyoto. So the very first thing that people said was that this definition is not only too aspirational, it's too inspirational, and there's no actual metrics. Like, how can you actually achieve this? Other people said that terms like polyphonic and concepts like active partnership are too academic and too scholarly, and that there's no real way to actually achieve any of this, and that based on the individual mission of a particular museum, there's no way that every single museum could actually attain this, right? And so they went back to the drawing board. Let me also say, I don't have it in this slide, they had over 250 proposed definitions from nations like all over, like different countries, nations all over. And it was really, it's a really interesting exercise to be able to go through and read. Some nations submitted like a single sentence, a single word, and other nations submitted like 2 paragraphs on what a definition is. So that's a really cool exercise. Next slide, please. Oh, before you go, the other thing that people absolutely hated is that the word education is now missing, right? So when we think about museums, we think that museums are there to primarily educate, and now the term education is no longer listed in this definition. Next slide. And so this is now the agreed upon current definition for a museum. And it was approved in the Prague annual meeting in 2022. A museum is a not-for-profit permanent institution in the service of society that researches, collects, conserves, interprets, and exhibits tangible and intangible heritage, open to the public, accessible and inclusive. Museums foster diversity and sustainability. They operate and communicate ethically, professionally, and with the participation of communities, offering varied experiences for education, enjoyment, reflection, and knowledge sharing. Do you like that one better? Okay. Oh, next slide, please. Okay, and so again, this push for why we need a new definition was inspired by many things. So this discourses around decolonization, activist scholarship, wanting to address responsiveness to social and civil unrest, centering things like social justice and empathy, and trying to figure out new 21st century practices for museum work. The thing that I want to point out here as well is that there's a really important museum scholar by the name of Stephen Weil, who shifted how we think about museums in the 21st century. And what he said is that in order to be a successful museum in the digital and information age, we must stop centering the object and begin to center people and communities. So that's really important. Next slide. And so I began sort of thinking about my work as a kind of what we call Sankofa. So Sankofa is a Ghanaian word in the Twi language, which means go back and get it or retrieve. And this is the Adinkra symbol for Sankofa as a concept. It's a bird that's looking back. It has an egg in its mouth, and it's looking back in order to move forward. Next slide. So here's some critical questions that continue to guide my research. How did museums get all their stuff? How did they acquire those collections? Who has authority over cultural heritage material? Do we have a moral obligation to return cultural heritage artifacts when nations ask for their sacred or cultural objects to be returned? Are museums simply tools for displaying the looted booty of civil unrest, war, and genocide? Is there value in displaying objects? And what narratives are being told about these objects? So the person that's depicted here is the Oba, which is sort of like the king, right, of the nation of Benin. And I'll talk more about him in a minute. Next slide. Thank you. And so this Oba, who has a long name that I always butcher, but I have it on the slide in a minute. This Oba was exiled from Benin, and in an incident in what is known now as what's called the Punitive Expedition, which happened in January of 1897. And essentially, it's a long story, but essentially, Benin was about to come under British rule. And Benin was one of the kingdoms in what we now call Nigeria that was able to continue to have its own authority. And this Oba kept being pressured to engage in trade, specifically with palm oil and some other things. And he kept saying, like, no, even though he sort of did sign his treaty, he didn't want to sort of participate in what was happening. And they sent an expedition to go and talk with him, but they sent the expedition during one of their most sacred festivals. And the Oba was so outraged that he sent basically a war party to go and murder this expedition. And so in retaliation, the British Royal Army sent dozens and dozens of soldiers to basically come and raid this Oba's kingdom, which resulted in this huge massacre. And as a part of that massacre, they burned down the Oba's palace and then looted and took over 2,500 objects, mostly bronze objects. And so this is a photograph of what sort of happened after this punitive expedition and what is known as the Benin Massacre. Next slide. And so over 40% of the objects that were taken from the Oba's palace end up at the British Museum. And so when you think about the British Museum, this is actually one of the most known sort of images when we think about the British Museum. If you go in the African Gallery, at the back of the African Gallery, there is just this stunning wall of this beautiful, beautiful plaques of Benin bronzes. And so essentially that booty, if you will, these cultural heritage objects were then sort of sold and auctioned off across Europe. Next slide. And this is just another a photograph of the interior of the Oba's compound after it was burnt down. And you can see some of these really important plaques and bronzes right here in the foreground. Next slide. And so when I say this term, the Benin bronzes, what I'm referring to is collectively the summation of this over 2,500 objects that quite literally were distributed across the world, largely Europe, as a result of this massacre that ended up in all of these really important museums and museum collections. Next slide. And so one of the things I forgot to mention is the ubiquitous nature of museums. So right here in America, there are more museums than the sum total of both Starbucks and McDonald's combined. So if you took the number of Starbucks and the number of McDonald's, they would still not equal the number of museums that we have. And that to me signals something, right? It signals that we are invested in culture, that we love museum going, that we think that cultural heritage is significant. Next slide. So there was something that was put together called the Savoy SAR report. These are two individuals, Benedicta Savoy and Falwin Sarr, who are European scholars who basically said there's actually no real index or database that catalogs the collective nature of all of these different bronzes. And so that you can access this free report called the Savoy SAR report. And that was really sort of groundbreaking. Next slide. And then we started to see an increase. And again, this is all sort of started kind of coming to a head during the pandemic because of all the conversations that were happening about race and equity and all of this. We started to see all of these institutions that had previously rebuffed calls for repatriating these objects now start to respond in kind. And again, leading with these Black Lives Matter statements or these like inclusive DEI kind of statements. So we have the University of Aberdeen was the first institution to pledge a full repatriation of the bronze sculpture depicting an Oba of Benin. We have the Humboldt Forum, which is Germany's newest museum. They announced an agreement with the Nigerian government to return a substantial number of works in 2022. The Met Museum in New York announced in June their plans to return 2 sculptures to Nigeria's National Commission for Museums and Monuments. The National Museum of Ireland pledged in April 2021 to return their large share of 21 works. And the French government unanimously voted in October of 2020 to return 20 pieces from French museums to both Benin and Senegal. I also want to point out, I never pronounced her name right, but it's like Ngiri Blankenberg, who was the then director at the Smithsonian African Art Museum. She put together America's first comprehensive decolonization plan and repatriation plan. She created phenomenal documents, and they were signed, and there was this whole thing. But secretly, silently behind the scenes, she actually got fired because of this work, which is a whole other thing we can talk about later. But the Smithsonian African Art Museum was the first sort of American museum at a national level that created these documents to return these items. Next slide. And then within the last 3 weeks, we have probably one of the most important developments, which is that the Netherlands returned 119 looted artifacts, again known as the Benin bronzes, to Nigeria. This is the largest repatriation in the history of the Benin bronzes, and truly in terms of artifacts in general. Next slide. And this is an image of some of the return artifacts. There was an actual ceremony where documents were signed, and this was huge. And this took place at the National Museum of Onakan in Lagos, Nigeria, in June. Next slide. And then the Boston Museum of Fine Art, 1 week later, after the Netherlands returned the 119 items, officially closed their Benin Kingdom gallery for a number of reasons. One, they could not come to an agreement with the original donor. So this donor donated, I think, over 25 different pieces. There was a lot of disagreement there, but essentially the Boston Museum of Fine Art said that they wanted to be a leader in this repatriation movement, and they closed this gallery, and essentially now they have some Nubian artifacts on display. And next slide. Essentially what they did was, and this is a picture of the gallery and the Benin bronzes, the plaques that you can see on the wall, and what used to be their Benin gallery. Next slide. And so the Boston Museum of Fine Art essentially also returned some items. So here's some things that I'm considering that I want you to also think about. Again, how did each of these nations acquire these objects? To whom were the objects returned? Who made the request for the objects to be returned? How does the acquisition of these objects meet the mission, vision, and collecting goals of each of these institutions? What does this mean for the future of museums? And what does this mean for the future of what we know of as African galleries in most museums? Next slide. So the thing that I want you to sort of see or understand or think about is this idea of what we call shared authority, or thinking about power. So this is an interesting thing to note. The Netherlands, in making the largest, most important return of these objects, right, returned 119 objects to the Nigerian government. The Boston Museum of Fine Arts returned the looted objects to the current Oba, or the current king of Benin, who, interestingly enough, is the great-great-grandson of Oba Oban Ramwin, who was the one who was exiled during the punitive expedition. And the current executive director of the Boston Museum of Art basically said, as custodians of these exceptional objects for the past 12 years, it is deeply gratifying to see them returned to their rightful owner. So in this case, I want you to think about, who is the rightful owner? Is the rightful owner the government of the country who's making the request, or is the rightful owner, the king of Benin? Next slide. And this is a picture of the signing that actually took place in New York. I just think it was interesting that, this particular museum is saying that the correct owner is the Oba and not the Nigerian government. Next slide. And so the question I have next is, so then what does restitution actually look like? Next slide. And so I want you to take note, there's a project called Digital Benin, Reconnecting Rural Art Treasures. And this is the first ever online digital platform that essentially visualizes that Savora Bar report, right? It basically allows you to click on this website and pull up actual beautiful digital images of all of the known Benin bronzes. So it's sort of like an online database. Next slide. And so again, we're talking about the rise of the African Museum, and we're starting to see a plethora of more and more museums opening on the continent. Next slide. So this is David Adaiji. He is a knighted architect, British Nigerian architect. He is the architect of the Smithsonian African American Museum in Washington, D.C. He is also was hired to create what will be the forthcoming Edo Museum of West African Art. This particular museum is really interesting to me. Next slide. Because the proposed, or not now proposed, but forthcoming Edo Museum of African Art is supposed to open this November. And it is supposed to be the largest museum in the world that will now house all of the returned looted objects from Nigeria. So the question that I have is, if these objects were not made for display, if they were, some of them were largely sacred objects, why, and they were, put in a museum, and there's all this controversy about whether or not the museum should have them and should they be on display, why are we sort of repeating the cycle by creating this new multi-million-dollar museum to now house these returned objects that were not meant to be displayed in the first place? Other thing I want to note is that there's an ongoing lawsuit of Nigerians who live in America who say that the Smithsonian African Art Museum's desire to return these objects to Nigeria actually is a detriment to Black Americans because it cuts Black Americans off from their cultural heritage, and they have a right to have access to that cultural heritage, which I think is a really interesting lawsuit. Next slide. So again, the museum is set to open in 2025. This is some of the images. They've made some really significant hires. Most of the hires are people who are British, Nigerian born, and we could talk more about that. Next slide. So there's a really important book that's kind of the basis of my scholarship called National Museums in Africa, Identity, History, and Politics that was published, I believe, 2022, 23. And then there's a really interesting article that was published in 21 that's titled, Could 2021 be the Year of the African Museum? And we started to see more and more articles about this, the rise of the African Museum. The thing I also want to note is that the most visited museum on the continent is the Museum of Black Civilization, which opened in 2018 in Senegal. And if you've ever seen images of this museum, there's I don't even know how large, I mean, it's hundreds, I don't know, it's like a massive statue in front of this museum that has become sort of like an iconic sort of global icon for Senegal itself. Next slide. So this is the Palais de l'Homme in Togo, which was opened in 2019. Next slide. And then some additional examples of museums that are opening just in West Africa alone. So you've got the Grand Egyptian Museum that, interestingly enough, was supposed to open in 2022 and has been pushed back, I think, now to almost 27. You've got the Pan-African Heritage World Museum that opened in 2023, the Museum of Humankind in Kenya in 24, and the Museum of Maritime History, which is the most anticipated one in Mozambique that opened in 2021. And approximately 24 new museums will be open on the continent between now and actually 2030. Next slide, please. So again, who will work in the museum? Who will steward the collection? What practices will the museum institute that will shape the future of museums? The issues around repatriation, reparations, African galleries, How will this museum benefit the people of Benin or Nigeria? How much will this museum charge for admission, right? Because Nigeria has one of the highest unemployment rates, right? And increasing issues of poverty. How will these works be interpreted? How will they be displayed? And is it wrong to do so? So these are the questions that I'm thinking about around the Edo Museum. And how does the decolonization process impact how we think about African objects, and particularly how we frame these African objects, particularly the bronzes, as art? Next slide, please. So just a few additional dimensions that I'm looking at. I'm looking at the impact in the art world. Next slide. So one of the things that we talk about at the Center for Arts, Migration, and Entrepreneurship is what we call the orange economy. The orange economy is looking at the ways in which artists infuse and increase a vibrant, healthy economy, right? And looking at the ways in which the arts helps to stabilize and flourish. And so one of the artists that I've been looking at for a long time is Kehinde Wiley. So Kehinde Wiley, we are very fortunate here at the Horn to have two Kehinde Wileys on display at a time. They were donations, or maybe they're on loan from the Toussaints here in Gainesville. And Kehinde Wiley, very famously painted the official Obama portrait, right? But the interesting thing about Kehinde Wiley is that he has started probably one of the most important artist residencies in in Senegal, called Black Rock. And it has become an extremely prestigious thing if you are selected as an artist to go and have a residency at Black Rock. Kehinde Wiley spends a lot of time on the continent and in Senegal. In infusing and in creating what we call, again, this orange economy and supporting this whole new blooming of African artists. Next slide. Another person that you need to know about is Zanele Mahole. So maybe 3 years ago now, the Commer Museum of Art in Jacksonville was the very last stop on this huge retrospective of Zanele Mahole's work. And it wasn't supposed to be a stop, but the executive director basically called a friend and asked if the exhibition could come to Florida. And we were able to, be able to have this show. There's some of her work currently on view at SCAD Museum of Art in Savannah right now. She is probably the most famous photographer and artist on the continent. She's a queer South African photographer. This is sort of her like alter ego, and I'm forgetting her name, something like the Black Lioness. But she has also created this like buying and acquisition frenzy, because if you are a museum worth your salt, then you have a Zanele Mahole, just like you would have a Kehinde Wiley. Next slide. This is Yinka Shonibari, who is another very famous African artist. It's really important if you have a Yinka Shonibari in your collection. And again, the reason why I want to point this out is because we are starting to see almost like a replacement, if you will, of art museums hyper-focusing on African art and African artists. And I think that this is a trend that you can definitely connect to this rise of African museums. And so that's what I'm trying to sort of trace in my current scholarship. Next slide. And if you've been to the Horn in the contemporary galleries, you've seen the Elanat suite that we have. We are fortunate to have this beautiful work in our collection here at the Horn. But again, if you are a museum and you're kind of worth your salt in terms of like thinking through the work that you have from African artists, you will have an Elanat suite. Next slide. And so again, just thinking through the implications for entrepreneurship and thinking through the orange economy, this is just some of the questions that I have. If you don't know about Chale Wote is the world's largest street art fair that happens in Ghana every year. It has basically become almost like the Coachella of Africa. It's like a huge event. And if you're an artist and you want to kind of break through the art world, you go to Charlie Wote. It's a lot of famous celebrities go there and hang out. Um, I want to go back to thinking through Black Rock Senegal for a little bit. So the rumor is that Kehinde Wiley will be opening a Black Rock Accra in Ghana and a Black Rock oh gosh, what is it? A Black Rock, I'm forgetting the name, some part of Nigeria. And so the idea is that there's going to continue to be this proliferation of Black rocks. The other thing that I want to point out is artists like Wangechi Mutu, for example, who had a beautiful retrospective at the Boston ICA, who is just like a phenomenal artist. Wangechi Mutu has returned to Kenya and has a studio there, and you're starting to see all of these super famous African artists return to Africa to build out these huge studios to support other rising African artists and to kind of have their own versions of Black rock. And so I'm thinking through like again how this impacts like collecting practices and things like that for museums. Next slide, please. And so I just want to talk through just briefly about some of the major roadblocks to repatriation. So the University of Cambridge Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology postponed their return of more than 100 bronzes to Nigeria after a presidential decree from the president named a royal ruler as the owner and custodian of all returned artifacts. Then in August 23, it was discovered that a longtime employee at the British Museum was responsible for the theft of many precious items from what we call the Benin bronze collection. So those are just some of the roadblocks that I wanted to point out. Next slide. So again, I have some critical questions for museum professionals. This is a question that museum professionals talk about a lot. Is it possible to decolonize the museum? Should museums start anew by returning all unethically acquired objects? So just not even just Nigerian objects. Should we think through and just return all of these objects that were acquired illegally? And if so, how might we use innovative digital technology such as AI or virtual reality to virtually display historically looted objects? So again, thinking about perhaps the Digital Benin project. How often should the definition of museums be updated to reflect changing museum praxis? And what is driving the dramatic increase of museums on the continent, and what is the impact? Next slide. So in terms of my research, in the last year and a half, my initial journey, I traveled to the British Museum. I wanted to document for myself the ways in which the Benin bronzes were on display, observe how people were interacting with them, take notes about how the objects were interpreted. This is Dr. Briley Rasmussen, who was my colleague when I first moved here in 2019. She was the then acting sort of director of museum studies. She now lives in London, and she actually received her museum studies degree in the UK. And so she was sort of my guide a little bit walking through the British Museum, and she put me in contact with a lot of professionals. She actually went to school with the person who's now the director of the British Museum. So that's a great connection. And so I was able to sort of document that. So I wanted to kind of begin here with this like major museum, right? Like who has over 40% of all of the looted Benin bronzes. Next slide. And then I want to thank, I got to do this in the beginning, huge thanks to first the UF Global Fellows Program, and then huge thanks to the Center for Humanities in the Public Sphere. Thank you so much, Jamie, for funding me to be able to spend the summer and spend part of last year traveling to Ghana. So I have 3 research sites, Ghana, South Africa, and Senegal. I haven't been able to go to Senegal yet. And I was invited by Dr. Samuel Norty, who is the head of ceramics at Kwame Nkrumah University, bless you, in Kumasi. And I had a fantastic time. So they invited me to give a lecture about my scholarship. I was able to meet with all of these brilliant students who come from across Ghana, but also across the continent, who are, it's literally the leading arts institution in Ghana, right? I think it might be the only, but it's the leading arts institution in Ghana. Brilliant ceramicists, brilliant art students. And then I was able to, next slide, I was able to then meet with, they gave me this piece that I was able to bring back. Next slide. I was able to meet with emerging curators, what we call EMPs, emerging museum professionals, got to tour the Kwame Nkrumah official sort of university museum, and then speak with students about global museum practice. And that was fantastic. So I flew from Accra to Kumasi to be able to do that. Next slide. And then I spent a lot of time in Kumasi at the Manhaya Palace Museum. And this was like such perfect timing. So as soon as I arrived in Accra, literally all everyone was talking about was this particular museum, and how for the first time in like 100, 200 years, these particular items were on loan. It's a collection of items, of gold items that were also looted from a particular war. It is a collection that was assembled from the Albert and Victoria Museum and the British Museum. And it's the first time that these gold objects were returned, or were actually on the continent, but returned to Ghana. They were quite literally taken from this palace. And so people were coming from villages far and wide, from parts of the city, literally making a pilgrimage to come and see these objects. They were sending all of their school uh, students on school field trips. You're not allowed to take a picture, but I explained to the guy what I was doing, and he was like, okay, hurry up and take the picture. So I hurried up and took the picture. So this is the only picture that I have. And so I was able to spend time there and meet with some of the museum professionals. It was interesting because a lot of the museum professionals, they have this like volunteer practice that's also kind of like mandatory in order for them to like go on to college or to work in society. And so a lot of them were going out of their way to have their placement in museums, which I thought was really interesting. Next slide. And then the highlight of my trip, so I got to visit all of these different museum professionals in and out of Accra at different institutions. But the main reason why I went, outside of being able to document this exhibition at the palace, was to go to the Inchinchen Museum. It's spelled really oddly, but it's pronounced Inchinchen. The Inchinchen Museum was started by a Kwame Nkrumah University graduate, a brilliant ceramicist and artist, who essentially is using ancestral veneration and worship and different rituals and principles to create his own new kind of museum. He's quite literally building new museum practice. And he now has a strong working relationship and partnership with the Equal Justice Institute, or otherwise known as the Lynching Memorial in Alabama. So they fly him out. He's the one who does all of these fantastic sculptures, and they just recently opened a sculpture park, and it is because of this artist's work. And so I was going there to document like what it means for an artist to create his own museum, using ancestral veneration, and basically saying like what we know of as a museum has shifted, and he's responding to that. So they have this annual festival every October. People come from all over the world. In order for you to even visit this museum, you have to take off your shoes. You have to walk barefoot down this like bamboo lined sort of path and pay homage to these ancestors. So they have these little sort of like ceramic heads or faces that he's using, that you can go there and have, like I could go right now and be like, hey, I want to be one of the faces, and he would model one of the faces after my face. So I was able to go to Intention and spend some time. So the plan is that hopefully I'll get funded and I'll be able to go back in this October for this sort of annual veneration ceremony. Next slide. And again, these are just some pictures of some other museums that I went to in throughout Ghana. Next slide. I just wanted to show you this to see the scale of some of the work that it's massive. I'm like 6 feet tall, and this is like, the scale is just massive, and the museum itself is just fantastic. Next slide. Yeah. Next slide. And he's basically building like an artist compound and residency again as well. So it's a trend that I'm seeing where you're seeing all of these artists basically say like, the institution has not given me what I need. I know what I need and I know what artists need. And we're going to build this new thing together, and we're going to build this new definition of what we think of as a museum. So hopefully I'll be able to stay there. That's the negotiation, is that I can come give a presentation and then stay in one of this beautiful, lovely new residences. Next slide. And this is again just some pictures from the. This third picture from the top left. This is where you have to take your shoes off and walk down that path to give veneration to the ancestors. Next slide. Again, next slide. And then these are images from South Africa. So the CAME team was invited to give a presentation at the University of Western Cape in Cape Town. It was absolutely fantastic. So I got to talk about my research and the research that we do at CAME. And one of my these are images from one of my research sites. This is a museum that essentially tells the story about apartheid and the movement and resettlement of communities. This is the Sixth Ward Museum. This woman pictured here at the top in the pink, she is fascinating. I want to write a whole book just about her. She is someone who quite literally lived. So when she was a younger woman, she was the government of South Africa actually gave everybody this little tiny suitcase and said, put all your crap in the suitcase. We're coming on this day and we're going to move you to a whole new settlement. And she is there as a living guide to talk through what happened. And this is the model that I'm looking at in Cape Town specifically, but across South Africa. They're using all of the elders in their community to tell stories. If you go to, excuse me, if you go to Robben Island to learn about the history of Mandela, a lot of the guys there are people who actually were detained and lived on Robben Island in prison. And to me, that's a really interesting model that they are going, that South Africa is going out of their way to seek out elders in community to be the ones who actually tell the stories at museums. Next slide, please. Oh, that's it. Thank you, everybody. So I now want to open the floor for any questions.
Larry, thank you, Porchia. So, go ahead.
I think the critical challenge with respect to returning all these things is for each of those countries to find a way to make admission to the museums free, like all the Smithsonian museums are, and the two on the UF campus. Otherwise, you're really excluding a huge number of the public.
I agree. This is also, I thank you for saying that, because this is also my other major concern. Is about like who are you employing? Because it's one thing. So this Edo Museum, I think the initial estimate was something like $18 million. And I think it went up, it ballooned to like over $25 million, right? So my question is, and when if you look at the research and you look at like the interviews and stuff, essentially what the museum is banking on is international tourism to help fund and support the museum, not necessarily the support and like connection of local community. And I'm curious about who are they going to hire a local community to work in the museum? And also exactly as you're saying, will the museum be open and free admission to local residents? And the reason why I also ask that is because almost everybody that they have hired to run this museum is not native born. They're born in the UK and they have like UK or American training. That to me is a significant thing to like point out. Like there's no sort of like native born curator.
I have a couple of comments.
Okay.
One is when I went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art last year during the winter, it was packed. There were thousands upon thousands of basically tourists there, from what I can see. And I think that goes on all the time. So these objects are and were getting huge eyeballs on them and appreciation. And I wonder how much that's going to happen in some of these African countries, where I don't think they have that kind of exposure, will ever have that kind of exposure. That, I mean, I saw some of those objects that you had there, similar, and it's just fascinating and it's wonderful. And not to have those here, I think, would be a big loss to, first of all, to our African American community, to see what their culture was. I also question perhaps and maybe I'm wrong, but the political stability in some of these countries where these objects are going to. And I feel that could possibly be at some point an issue. I mean, Africa is not a settled continent. I was just looking right now, you have the Lord's Resistance Army, which is in Central African Republic. You have the Allied Democratic Forces. You have M23. You have JNIM. You have, I mean, there are all sorts of insurrections going on. And it seems to me some of these museums become an interesting target for black market sale of these objects or something. So these are just some of my thoughts that I had during your conversation, which I thought was wonderful. I really appreciated it, and I appreciated the objects. Thank you for that. And I was wondering what your thoughts are about my comments. One, that people who come to the United States, we certainly have a lot more tourists here than you probably ever would have in some of these African countries. So they're getting, these objects are and were getting significant exposure, which...
So thank you for your comment. So the thing I will say is, so for example, the museum that I showed, I don't know what slide that is, I would say go back. The palace in Kumasi. So as I was mentioning, this whole idea about the pilgrimage, quite literally thousands of people a day. Even though the palace, I mean, the palace is somewhat large. It's not, the size of the Met, but you're talking about thousands of people a day. Native Ghanaians who were coming to pay homage. The Civilization Museum that I mentioned in Senegal, thousands of visitors a day, all mostly local or like just coming from different parts of the continent. And in terms of the issue around unrest, yes, but, or yes, and, because the Edo Museum is built in a place that's considered safe, even though there's all kinds of things happening. I think that the media here definitely also portrays like some of this unrest as like a little more sensational than it actually is. And that this actually is a conversation, this is a global conversation, right? Like anytime you have cultural heritage objects, if there's someone or a group or entity who doesn't want those things to exist, they go to those institutions first. I'm trying to think your other comment that I wanted to respond to.
About so many tourists coming to America and to Britain,
yes,
to see these objects,
yes,
that they wouldn't have an opportunity.
Yes, and so that's my question or inquiry about this new Edo Museum of West African Art, because like I said, they're banking on this like global or international tourism to this particular institution, and I don't know if that's going to be a reality. I mean, maybe, but I'm not sure. Like I think in my head, from what I've sort of conversations that I've had and things that I'm reading, I think the idea is that this new Edo Museum will basically be like a kind of, not quite the British Museum, but you know what I mean? Like it will have a kind of cachet, particularly because they were very intentional in hiring this particular architect. This people come from all over the world to the Smithsonian Museum of African American History just to look at the outside of that building because of the architecture, right? And so it was a really intentional choice to have him because he's kind of got like a fan base. Like people go all over the world, just sort of like how we think about Frank Lloyd Wright. People go all over the world to see his work. And so I don't know. I think I'm hoping that like in November or sometime after, I'll be able to go to visit that museum and like kind of think through and see and observe like what's the visitorship. Yeah.
I just have one other question.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want you to take it the wrong way, but I was curious as to why, when you mentioned one of the artists, a Black woman lesbian.
Oh, Zanele Mahole?
Yeah. But why did you mention her sexuality? You didn't do that with
It's
any of the other artists. And it just struck
Yeah.
me as strange. You didn't say, well, he's straight and he's gay, she's gay, you know? So I'm just curious.
I think I would totally erase everything about who she is to not mention that for a couple reasons.
Why?
She mentions that that's like a huge part of her art. So the image that I showed is part of I think it's called the Dark Lioness. It's part of her not mask. It's like her alter ego, right? That is a queer entity. That you cannot talk about her work without talking about her sexual orientation because it's like embedded like throughout her work. So like the sexuality, her racial identity, all of that. Also, she quite literally has changed the landscape of South African photography and has created an entire community and conversation around what it means to be queer and African and an artist. And so it's just sort of like, I don't know, it's just, there's no way to kind of really talk about her work without talking about her sexual identity, especially because in South Africa and across most of Africa, to be queer is like quite literally illegal. So she's literally like putting her life on the line to center that identity.
Okay. You answered that. Thank you.
Yeah, there was a point in your talk on the screen where the last question, I think, was about the future of African, what is the meaning of the future of African galleries?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if you meant in the West, but certainly I thought in the United States, because we were talking about that. So I'm coming from no knowledge at all. So if the colonized objects if the space is decolonized, let's say, and the objects are returned back to Africa, what is going to be there?
Mm-hmm.
And is it that some of the African artists of today, or maybe that are very productive, are going to be selling their work to museums in the West, and that way populate some of these African galleries, but
Mm-hmm.
then and placed it, there be photographs of what was looted in the past,
Mm-hmm.
and juxtaposed to some of the new artistic creations that are going on in Africa today that make it into, the West, or what's going to happen there?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that question. That's a great question. So the first thing I will say is, why do we have African galleries? This is a question that a lot of art curators are asking. And also, how are African galleries framed? Because if you go to certain museums, there is an African gallery that is quite ethnographic. So you'll see largely masks and objects that are considered ethnographic. You will not see contemporary African art or artists. Like you would not in a traditional African gallery see Benin bronzes, a Zanele Mahole, and an Ella Natsui. You would not see that because most African galleries are framed as ethnographic. and like objects that are presented way from the past, right? Um, and interestingly enough, in some museums, you will see the African gallery, and then you'll have a whole entire gallery or section about Egypt, as if Egypt is not in Africa. And this is a huge discourse that is happening. You will also see a discourse about, should we have mummies? Should museums have mummies? Because mummies are essentially, the way that we have framed them within the context of a museum, are sacred burial or funerary objects that are put on display without someone's permission. So there's a conversation about, should African galleries even exist? Are we like sort of ghettoizing, for lack of a better term, African material culture? And if there's going to be an African gallery, then it should contain different types of artists, different genres, different time periods, not just be what we like, masks and like traditional sort of ethnographic objects. So that's sort of part of that question around, should we have African galleries? Because why are they sort of separated? Like when you think about a sort of traditional encyclopedic art museum, the gallery theme sort of makes sense. But when you're talking about other types of museums, why do we need the African gallery? So for example, right here at the Horn, that has been also an ongoing conversation. And if you've ever been to the Horn and you've been to the African galleries, it was somewhat ethnographic. And within the last year, I'm forgetting his name, they brought in a curator from New York. So currently, I haven't even seen actually the new show, but what was on view a couple of weeks ago was a completely new reimagining of the African gallery. And the theme was something like Ghanaian textiles and like African feminism. And it's a 3-part series. So that was the first series. And they, I think in the last week or two, have installed whatever is the new series. And it's the idea that the Horn is joining this global conversation about, do we need African galleries? Just like, do we need Asian galleries? Like, how and why is the work being separated in that way? And so some people are playing around. So you'll have an African gallery that might have a Zanele Mahole, a Yonka Shonabari, some Benin bronzes or similar items, to have a conversation about like how the work and the artists have changed like over time. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but like, so we're thinking through like, what is the purpose of a museum? What is 21st century museum practice? Do we need to get rid of the African gallery and reconceptualize how those objects could be reimagined and displayed throughout the museum and not have them be, African, if that makes sense?
Well, I appreciate your answer. It's very, very complicated. And I can see how each place, each museum or whatever, this is an evolving issue.
Yeah.
And it affects everything as to how do you categorize it, how do you imagine it, But I'm familiar with in other, in literature, what is Latin American literature versus whatever, once you start looking at parts of the world and saying that's what it is. And then some writers say, I don't want to be just placed in a Latin America. I'm a world artist or something. And, you find I can see this endless discussion. So it's thank you for your answer, but I can see it's very evolving. And very interesting.
Thank you for that. I'll end by saying, one of the other main arguments is that we know for sure that artists like Picasso, for example, quite literally consumed African masks and other artifacts. And so many of modernists, lots of different types of artists that we think of as like very canonized artists, and the impact and influence of these quite literally looted objects being then on display in museums and then being placed in these African galleries, the ways in which white canonized artists were greatly impacted by viewing these objects. And why are we not putting these objects together in a gallery and having a certain kind of discourse and conversation, as opposed to saying, here's a Picasso over here, who clearly is influenced by this African mask, and then here are the African objects over here, and then here's Egypt over here, all in one building. Like what we are lessening the conversations that we could have about what is art, and again, what is a museum. Thank you.
With that, let's thank Dr. Moore for a wonderful presentation.